tackle this issue. So hopefully you're all now seeing my full screen.
Yep, we can see that. Brilliant.
All right, so just to give you a bit of an overview about what the Lancet Countdown is and what we do. The Lancet Countdown is at its core a big research collaboration. We bring together 43 leading academic institutions and UN agencies from around the world and over 120 experts from a very broad range of fields, from political scientists, medics, epidemiologists, climate scientists, economists. And we all come together once a year to produce these reports that get published in the medical journal The Lancet ahead of the COP climate negotiations. And in these indicators we publish with the last year that you can see here enlarged. We published 44 indicators. Our indicators track progress on health and climate change up to date. We look at the health impact that climate change is already having on our health in every country. We look at the way countries are responding, and particularly what that response means in terms of health and health co-benefits of the transition to a low-carbon economy. I'm going to present to you today the key findings of our latest report. And to start off with our key takeaway message, our latest report gives a code red for health. We're seeing that across all of the indicators in which we're tracking the health impacts of climate change on human health, things are very rapidly getting worse. We see health impacts of climate change in every country, but particularly in the most vulnerable peoples of every country. And we see with concern that climate change is starting to exacerbate health inequities in every place of the world. When we think about heat waves, these are probably the most notorious and most obvious effect that we're seeing of climate change. And we've seen last year record heat waves in the Northwest USA, in Canada, in Sicily, in Kazakhstan, in Russia. Heat waves are of particular concern for health because in those communities and in those peoples that are especially vulnerable, people over 65 years of age, very young children, people that live with underlying health conditions like heart disease, kidney disease, they can prove lethal, and we see excess mortality in heat waves every time they happen. So what we're tracking here is how exposure of vulnerable people to heat waves is changing. We look at the people over 65 years of age and those under 1 year old. And as you can see, exposure has increased pretty significantly in the past, say, roughly 10 years, with over 3 billion more person days of heat wave exposure in 2020 of people over 65 years of age than in a baseline that finished only 16 years ago. And looking at very young children, this amounts to 6 million more person days of heat wave exposure. These are exposures that are putting the health of all of these people at risk. And with the rising temperatures, we also see changes in rainfall patterns with increased incidence of droughts and also flash floodings. Another of the most notable consequences of climate change that we have also seen over the past few years are the increased incidence of wildfires and the increased exposure of humans to wildfires. Just last year, we've seen devastating images coming from Greece, Turkey, the US, Canada, Siberia. And with the changes in the environmental conditions, humidity, precipitation, and temperature also comes an increase in the risk of wildfires and wildfire spread and increased human exposure to wildfires. We're seeing that 72% of the countries we've looked at saw an increased human exposure to wildfires in the period from 2017 to 2020, compared with just the beginning of this millennia. 60% of countries in that same time period saw an increase in human exposure to extremely high wildfire danger defined by the changing meteorological conditions. This we do with remote sensing tools. We monitor direct exposure to risk and to wildfires. But what we're not showing you here is the increased health impact that also comes from exposure to wildfire smoke, which obviously has huge effects on people in terms of respiratory symptomatology, particularly on children, those with asthma, and also direct burns due to the high temperatures of exposure that we're also not reflecting here. And with the changes in temperature, in the humidity and precipitation patterns, obviously also comes changes in the environmental conditions that would favor or not the transmission of infectious diseases. We track 4 major infectious disease groups in our indicator. One is diseases like dengue, chikungunya, Zika. You can see in the screen now our results for dengue. We also track changing environmental suitability for the transmission of malaria, of Vibrio pathogens, and of Vibrio cholera in particular. And across all of these diseases, we're seeing that the environmental suitability is shifting the transmission of these diseases and is starting to increasingly expose people that are unprepared to deal with these diseases. What you can see on screen, as I said, is the changing environmental suitability for the transmission of dengue. Dengue is a leading cause of serious illness and death in many Latin American and Asian countries, and its global incidence is growing really, really rapidly. Part of this growth is due to climate change, also to people movement and to the spread of the vector. What we track here is the environmental suitability for the transmission of dengue by their mosquitoes, by Aedes albopictus and Aedes aegypti. And we're seeing that globally, this potential for transmission has increased by 7% for albopictus and 13% for aegypti in 2020 with respect to a baseline of the 1950s. And what you can see here in screen is that the biggest increases have been seen particularly in the Americas and the Western Pacific, that are two regions with endemic dengue where this is a huge burden of disease. So the climate changes are making our control efforts for these diseases increasingly difficult. As I said, we're seeing also increased suitability for malaria, for vibriosis, for cholera. And just like this, we're also seeing throughout all of our indicators, conditions getting worse, with increasing loss of safe hours for physical activity due to the rising temperatures, increased heat-related mortality, the lethality of extreme weather events also going up, marine food security being put increasingly at risk. We're losing hours of labor, our labor capacity going down because of the high temperatures undermining people's capacity to work outdoors. We're also seeing sea level rise, putting people, particularly in coastal areas, increasingly at risk. Our potential crop yields going down as a result of the rising temperatures, and also as a result of drought events that are affecting more and more of the global land area. And perhaps more concerningly is that with all of these health impacts of climate change and climate change risks increasing so rapidly and all of these warning signs, the world is still failing to deliver a response that is fast enough, and especially that is just and equitable. And we see a lot of parallelisms in the way the world is responding to the climate crisis, to the way that the world responded to COVID-19, in which we also saw a lack of international cooperation and coordination to tackle this global crisis. With all of these increased health risks, obviously health systems need to start getting more and more prepared to cope with increased extreme events, to cope with multiple and coinciding health emergencies. So what we try also to monitor is the extent to which countries are starting to implement the National Health Emergency Framework, which are mandated by the international health regulations. These frameworks are meant to help countries cope with health emergencies, strengthen their resilience. But as you can see here, only 75% of all countries that answered to this survey of 166 countries, only 75% reported medium to high level of implementation of the national health emergency frameworks. But what is perhaps more concerning, if you look at this graph on the left, is that the very high Human Development Index countries, those countries with most resources, better quantification of human developments according to the UNDP-defined Human Development Index, they have achieved roughly 90% of implementation of their core capacities for the international health emergency framework. However, the most vulnerable countries, those with low and medium level of Human Development Index, only reach about 50% of implementations, meaning that those that are most heavily impacted by climate change, that are already more vulnerable, are also the least prepared to deal with increasing health risks. This obviously threatens to exacerbate this gap between high Human Development Index and low Human Development Index countries. And of course, adapting will not be enough. We know that there's limits to adaptation, so it's very urgent that we accelerate our efforts for decarbonization. And the biggest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions is the energy system. We have the technology today to decarbonize our energy system. We know how to do this. And yet, if you look at the black line here, the carbon intensity of the global energy system has remained fairly static since the 1970s. The carbon intensity obviously measures the amount of carbon produced per unit of energy that we're generating, and this has roughly not changed. At the pace of decarbonization that we've seen since 2014, it would take us roughly 150 years to fully decarbonize the global energy system, which of course is absolutely incompatible with Paris Agreement goals and with a healthy future. When we look at countries with different level of Human Development Index, again, we're seeing that countries with a very high Human Development Index are starting to decarbonize their energy systems, are starting to shift to newer technologies, cleaner technologies. Whereas other countries with high, medium, or low Human Development Index are still growing their economies based on carbon-intensive development, undermining their health and also contributing to air pollution that directly harms human health. And that is why we're particularly concerned about these differences. When we look at air pollution, as I said, very, very linked to the energy system, to the use of fossil fuels for energy generation, for road transport. In 2019, 3.3 million deaths were attributable to ambient PM 2.5, the small particles that are the most harmful shape of air pollution. And 1/3, roughly 1 million deaths, were directly related to the burning of fossil fuels. And again, as you can see in this graph, we're seeing that it's the medium and high Human Development Index countries that have the biggest burden of mortality attributable to PM 2.5, and the countries that are still growing their economies, mostly based on carbon-intensive technologies. One interesting thing is that if we look at the low Human Development Index group, this country group has a particularly high burden of disease from the use of dirty fuels in the domestic sector, the burning of biomass, and the lack of access to a centralized clean energy system. Only about 5% of rural households in the low Human Development Index country group rely primarily on clean fuels and technologies for cooking, according to the WHO. Only 5% of rural households have clean fuels for cooking. The rest use dirty fuels that contribute not only to climate change, mainly through land use change, but also to increased levels of air pollution. And an interesting area where there's huge co-benefits, particularly to be enjoyed through the diet, is especially the agricultural sector. The agricultural sector is a big contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions, and this is especially so for cattle and ruminant livestock, which has a very high carbon intensity. What you can see in this graph on the left, in this kind of, let's say, orange-brown sectors, these are greenhouse gas emissions coming from cattle, and from cattle, both meat and dairy, in the low, medium, high, and very high Human Development Index country groups. And as you can see here, it is the very high Human Development Index country groups which have the most emissions coming from cattle. Obviously, excess red meat consumption not only contributes to greenhouse gas emissions, but also has a huge burden on health. When we look at the deaths that are attributable to the excess consumption of red meat, most of which is cattle again, it is the very high Human Development Index group, once again, that has the highest level of mortality per capita attributable to excess red meat consumption. We're seeing that decarbonizing both our energy system and our diets will provide enormous benefits to health, through cleaner air, through healthier diets, reduced red meat consumption. The same happens when we think about road transportation, the huge co-benefits of transitioning towards healthier modes of transportation, picking up on more active means of travel, and reducing the road travel from fossil fuels and other vehicles. This is really the core of why the health community needs to be at the forefront of the request to decarbonize our economies, because there's so enormous health gains to be made from transitioning to cleaner diets and cleaner sources of energy. However, despite all this kind of fairly bleak scenario, we do see that there's still some signs of hope. When we look at the energy system, again, the biggest contributor, there is good progress being made in terms of transitioning to the use of clean, new renewables, particularly wind and solar energy. They have been increasing at an average rate of 17% per year globally, with total global electricity generation from new renewables reaching a peak of 7.2% in 2018. That's the last year that we had data for. And if you look at this graph, it is the countries that contribute the most in terms of total emissions: China, the US, Germany, India, that are being the fastest at transition at picking up these new renewables. So this is a real reason for hope. However, we're obviously still very, very late in this transition. And as I said before, when we think about the enormous co-benefits that could arise from the transition to low carbon systems, and when we think about the enormous health impacts of climate change on health, it is no doubt that climate change and climate change mitigation should be a priority for the health community. Yet the healthcare sector is also a big contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, amounting to about 5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. If you look at this graph, here what we're plotting is the emissions from the health system per capita versus the Human Development Index. It looks very similar if we look at the Healthcare Quality and Access Index. So this is roughly a measure of quality of healthcare. We can think of it that way. And what I wanted to look at here is that up to about 600 emissions per capita in kilograms of CO2 equivalent, when we increase quality of healthcare provision and Human Development Index, we also see that paired to an increase in greenhouse gas emissions, obviously because in a carbonized system, any sort of expenditure comes today with increased emissions. However, already today we have countries that offer the same level of similar levels of Human Development Index, human access, healthcare access and quality, and much less emissions. We have very efficient systems. On this side of the scope, you'll find countries like Italy, like France, providing very good quality of healthcare with relatively low emissions. On the other end of the scope, we see countries like the US that has a very high carbon intensity healthcare system. So already today, with the technology that we have and that we have incorporated, we have the opportunity of transitioning towards much lower carbon intensity healthcare systems that can protect human health from climate change. And one enormous reason for hope is that the NHS in England has been the first healthcare system to commit to going full net zero by 2045. And this has been followed in COP by 47 countries. I think it's now kind of 51 countries actually, I should have taken this, that have committed to developing climate resilient and low carbon health systems, with 12 of them committing to net zero by 2050. This is enormously important, not only because it will help mitigate those 5% of global emissions from the health system, but also because it means that the health community is starting to understand that climate change is our health priority, should be a health priority, and that tackling climate change is absolutely essential for us to protect the health of present and future generations. And just to close very quickly, we're seeing that most of COVID recovery plans, as we're trying to emerge from this health emergency, we're starting to designate COVID recovery funds amounting to about 3 million, mostly to carbon intensive recovery. This would absolutely undermine Paris Agreement goals. However, COVID recovery also gives us an opportunity to reactivate and reshape our economies in a way that we can deliver economic recovery, environmental sustainability, but also particularly better health and reducing inequities. We need to avoid exiting the COVID-19 health crisis to enter the climate change crisis area. However, obviously, we need international cooperation to make this happen, and particularly to ensure that countries act together for a just transition and ensure that no one is left behind. And with that, I would invite you to visit lancetcountdown.org, where you can find a bit more about our indicators and explore data at a country level. And stop sharing so that Anthony can continue.
Ooh. How do I share? Oh, there, sorry. Whoops. Ah. What's happened to my, there. Right, can you see that?
Yeah.
I'm assuming you can. Thank you very much. And thanks for inviting us. And I'm going to, as a pediatrician, child health person, I'm going to focus a bit more on children because in a sense, the climate crisis is all about the future for our children. And what the hell can we do about all of this? It was great to spend a week in Glasgow at COP, which was very interesting. In fact, I didn't stay in Glasgow. I had to live in Balloch because rents were too high. But I was delighted to see that the traditional Scottish breakfast was served at the pub I stayed at. Heart attack on a plate, I think it's called. It was delicious, by the way. And it was really nice to see that the young Glaswegians were out in force, showing their great historical tradition for political dissidents. This is the problem that we face. It all comes down to a very simple figure, which is that the greenhouse gas carbon dioxide, the predominant one, is relentlessly rising, despite all the conferences, protocols, accords, agreements, and maybe Glasgow will just be another event on the way. If we look at emissions, comparing large countries, United States has been pretty flat since 1990. It's come down a little bit. United Kingdom, next one down, has reduced its production emissions, but we don't include consumption emissions on that graph. And then big countries like India and then Pakistan have very low emissions per capita, but because they're big countries, they do contribute to the global pool. Now, we did a talk in Pakistan with Pakistan this morning, actually, and Pakistan is fascinating, but they have very diverse geography, but they have extreme heat waves already present, very heavy rainfall and floods, particularly in their northern areas. They have droughts in Sindh province and in Baluchistan, and sea level rise will certainly threaten their capital city. So it's a typical country where they are rather resentful of what the West does, particularly at places like COP, because they're suffering the impacts and feel they haven't contributed much to the cause. If we look at the state of the world's nutrition over the past 20 years or so, things have stayed pretty flat in terms of the prevalence of undernourishment and the number of people. And it really flipped upwards last year during the pandemic for obvious reasons, economic reasons, transport reasons, disruption to rural economies especially. But as Marina has pointed out, there are effects from climate change, which will happen in the longer term. And climate change is interacting with a whole complex of economic and other issues. So this is water security. The world is not on track to reach SDG 6. The climate crisis is in large extent a water crisis because of the variability of rainfall, the droughts, the floods, etc. And of course, for COVID-19 around the world, water is an integral part of our response. And in blue are what the World Bank see as the key issues around water, which is fundamental to climate change. You know, how you have systems that are sustainable, inclusive, properly financed, institutionally solid and resilient. Now, looking at children, of course, breastfeeding is a fundamental thing for children around the world. And we're at the lowest rates of breastfeeding in human history, with many reasons for that, cultural, commercial, and otherwise. And we know that in addition to the impact that this may have in terms of deaths in poor countries, there may be cognitive effects and also effects on obesity and diabetes. And added to that is this colossal food industry pumping out sugary products, ultra-processed food, which is leading to an epidemic, a pandemic of obesity in children with all the consequences that will have. And in addition to those kinds of problems, we have the fact that 90% of the world's children breathe toxic air every day, a staggering statistic. Glasgow, London, okay, we're much better than South Central Asian, East Asian cities, but it is a pretty dire example of the impact that burning fossil fuels have on us already. So when I was at WHO, I left about 3 years ago, we set up a commission for which eventually became a commission called A Future for the World's Children, ? Chaired by Helen Clark, who is former Prime Minister of New Zealand, Awa Kolsek, a pediatrician, but also a Minister of State from Senegal. We had commissioners from all over the world. And if you want that report, and indeed, if you want the countdown report of climate change this year, you can download both for free from the Lancet website. Our Future for the World's Children was published last year in February 2020. And basically, the issue is this, that we need health in every ministry. We need children in every ministry. Transport, road injury, leading cause of death. In Pakistan, 2 years ago, there were 36,000 deaths, mainly in young adults from that. Agriculture and trade, we know subsidies, trade rules are important and crucial both for climate change and for good nutrition. Planning for playable spaces, reductions in the massive problems of air pollution, family services. As we urbanize, children are more prone to live in families with domestic violence or antisocial behavior. Many, many children, 40% of children live in informal settlements. And of course, education is a central issue for future productivity, health, social competence, etc. And we know that progress on regardless of climate change, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, has stalled. Many countries are actually not reporting this data. About a quarter of the world's population live in fragile states, and that's obviously linked with climate change impacts as well. So after, you can publish reports in the Lancet, which is all very well, and you might get media and stuff. But after that, what are you going to do about it? So we wanted to set up a kind of catalyzer movement for children in all policies. So we've called it CAP 2030. We got some funding to start earlier this year. It's very early days. The principle is that countries should lead this. And we've got a small secretariat at UCL, but we link with WHO, UNICEF, and all of the reach that they have. And I'll just go through the 5 things that we learned from our report and what we can do, much of which will affect climate change. So women and children have to be placed at the center. We have to leave behind a world that is potentially better for our children, not worse. There are financial costs involved in that. And we need to get the issue of women and children being at the center into cabinets, not just into ministries of health, but into the central cabinet of every government. And money talks, so we need to explain that James Heckman, who won his Nobel Prize, an economist, showed that the earlier you invest in women and children, prenatally, preconceptually even, and in infancy, you get a huge return to your unit dollar and you prevent all kinds of social and economic problems later. This sounds boring, unified multi-sectoral action, but it means that if you want to operate across sectors to improve children's lot and protect them from climate change, you need the cabinet involved rather than individual ministries, which are the worst at linking up, actually. You need to engage with districts because that's where the different sectoral ministries tend to come together in the same buildings. And you have to link with communities in a way that really engages them. And all of those require strategies which we're thinking about and which countries have done, some countries have done very well on. And municipalities, cities are extremely important. Just a few examples of what we've got going. So in Argentina, Raul Mercer, who's a pediatrician, said he wanted to set up a network on children's rights across Latin America. And he started that process and got, I think, about half a dozen countries already signed up to this. In Ghana, it's interesting, they want to look at early child development. So they held a meeting back in September with ministers, with pediatricians, with NGOs, and most of all with children. And the interaction was extremely interesting because children don't often get invited. In fact, there was a prize-winning design by children for, play areas and the like, their own designs. And I think we can do this much more creatively. In South Africa, during the pandemic, they introduced prohibition so that they could free up hospital beds for COVID patients. And it seemed to show a really big impact on child health and exposure to domestic violence and the like. So they're looking at what lessons they can learn from that and how that might translate into broader policies. In Nepal, we're working with a group to see if adolescents can use citizen science methods using mobile phones to collect data about their local ecosystems, and then do participatory learning and action with local farmers, community leaders, teachers, municipalities to come up with climate resilience policies. So a very local approach and a very positive and creative approach with young people. And the same in Pacific Islands with indigenous peoples, where they face an imminent threat from sea encroachment, but also protecting their culture and campaigning against the issues that are going to affect them. In India, working on urban planning for children and how to make low-cost housing more resilient. And in France, mental health issues, Senegal, social protection issues, working for the most vulnerable children. And one interesting thing that we've worked with France on is to set up a youth council, an international youth council of articulate young people who can think about ideas and come back at intervals to discuss policies and give advice. But I think this also needs to be taken from a global level down to national and regional levels. And I think the voices of young people, firstly, they know about climate change probably more than any of us. And they also have great ideas and they're creative and it's their future. So what do we do on climate? That's another picture from Glasgow, actually. A girl went past me saying, I'm very worried, which is fair enough, actually. We need collective action, and it's urgent. Our house is on fire. Greta Thunberg has told us. That's a picture of Australia, where people ran into the sea to escape wildfires. It was that bad. And no region is spared. I mean, we all know this. Every region in the world is affected. So just a few things. Clearly, we need action by governments, by corporates and financial people. One bit of encouragement I took away from Glasgow was that a lot of big funding corporations and investment houses were there, and money drives the world economy. And if they decide to withdraw from investing in fossil fuels, then hopefully that will bring about quite a rapid change, particularly now that renewables are actually cheaper. So this could save a lot of money, and I hope we can move on that. Just very quickly, because we need to have time to discuss this. The government actions, I'm sure most of you know about. We need to support renewable energy, cut subsidies. Many countries across the world, as Marina showed, have negative carbon prices in that they are subsidizing rather than penalizing the polluters and making them pay. Active and public transport, carbon neutral buildings. We are the most deforested country, or one of the most deforested countries in the world. And we need to do much more about reforesting and rewilding. I know Scotland is doing a lot in that area. Recycling, sustainable agriculture is immensely important, and increasing our proportion of plant-based diets. We don't have to give up meat, but we do need to change the patterns and frequency of what we do. Green business and infrastructure, of course, is what needs to happen. And in your hospitals, your universities, you need to have reduction targets. You need to have 100% renewable energy contracts. You want to get everybody engaged in this because there's lots that people can do. My own university has got some very active professional services people involved. Carbon neutral buildings, reforesting, lobbying, green innovation. And finally, the individual actions for net zero is to discuss it. All of the issues we've talked about, we will have to, active transport, walking, cycling is so important. We've got a long way to go to catch up with our Scandinavian, European partners there. So all of this is important. Finally, when we did our ranking you'll see that we not only ranked countries according to the usual SDG indicators of children flourishing or not, and you always have Norway, Japan at the top and Chad and Somalia at the bottom, but you can then ask which countries will be exceeding their emissions targets for 2030. And of course, it flips on its head. And so Qatar and USA and Australia and actually UK are near the top. And so it shows that we're all in this together and we all have to take action. In some ways, the wealthy world is causing more problems than the poorest. And we've worked this year with WHO and UNICEF to try and get them to produce simpler, easier to understand data for policymakers. One policymaker at Glasgow said that he worked on COVID with the British government and none of them read academic papers. They didn't have time, and policymakers need something very digestible, very quick, very simple. And this is a scheme that WHO, UNICEF and us have come up with to look at indicators across the age range. How are we doing? Reds, orange, yellow, green, and gray is do we have data or not? And we're going to roll this out in the new year. And hopefully that will also lead on not just to monitoring, but to reviewing and acting in order to hold some accountability. Finally, protection from commercial marketing. We just had a 3-day conference last week about this, which was fascinating because we're proposing actually an optional protocol added to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, because we live in an age of surveillance capitalism. We need new protocols to regulate, particularly against the massive commercial harm being done to children, not just from the usual suspects like tobacco, alcohol, sugary drinks, also gambling. And we've seen a big rise in problem gambling in the UK because of the kind of blanket exposure to gambling ads, both in online games and on sports events, but also the massive new trends in commercial marketing, where every time you're online or on your mobile, whatever you're looking at, you then have a algorithmically determined ad fired at you. And our children are bombarded with this. Their privacy is completely stolen by all the big, the Facebooks, the Googles, and many others. And a lot of other advertising agencies steal it and then sell it to Google and Facebook and the like. And, using brain scans and eye movements and EEGs to work out which attracts children the most. And of course, this new move into 3D and the metaverse. We're up against a Wild West and we need to do much more about that. And this links into consumption and to climate change ultimately. So on that, I'll finish and perhaps we can have a bit of a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marina and Anthony, for a fantastic overview of the countdown and a really interesting background. I thought it was just really interesting to hear about which countries are making progress on developing their sustainable energy. And I was quite surprised that the leader was China. I don't think that's publicized very well. So we've got time for Q&A, and I can see Danny White has his hand up, so I'm going to allow Danny to talk. And if anybody else has a question, please raise your hand and I can allow you to talk, or add it to the Q&A bar and I can read it out to Anthony and Marina. So Danny, I've allowed you to unmute if you'd like to ask your question.
Hello, thank you very much. That's fantastic. And obviously masses of things could possibly be discussed from that. But you highlight the issues around the inequalities in the lack of climate justice, and often when people advocating green policies are challenged by, well, what's the point of us doing anything here, because China, the most populous country in the world, is still building new coal power stations. Now, it seems like a really obvious response is to highlight how in general, we in Britain are using about 10 tons of carbon per capita, and the Chinese are only using 5 tons. And until we're only using the polluting at the same rate as the Chinese, we shouldn't be telling them what to do. And so a very easy metric for climate justice would be that everyone should aspire to live on the same amount of carbon per year per capita, which I understand would have to be about 3 or 4 tons. Why is it that none of the I've never heard advocates of radical action on climate change use that as a metric?
Well, you make some very important points. I think it may be as low as 2 to 3 tons per head, and it is a difficult target to achieve. Look, the poorer countries say you've been burning coal since 1820 and we've been burning coal since 1950, and therefore you've had the benefits of it. And there is some justice in that, but we're all in the same position now. And hopefully they can try and bypass fossil fuel expansion and move to renewables in the same way that they did with mobile phones and didn't go through the kind of big landline process that we had. And of course, with China, it's certainly true they're still dependent on coal, and India certainly is. If they are giving commitments to change, and I think the Chinese are very serious about this, and they are trying to expand renewables rapidly. In the meantime, they're trying to keep their economic growth going. But you're right. I mean, this is a huge problem for all of us. How do we reduce consumption? And how do we really meet targets that are real and make the polluter pays? You know, polluters should pay. And at the moment, they're not. In fact, they're being subsidized to pollute. So we have to address these issues. And we need governments to live up to their responsibilities, which they haven't. I mean, the Barbadian Prime Minister spoke at Glasgow and said, you've invested $25 trillion to prop up the global economy after financial crises, and yet you can't cough up $100 billion for loss and damage by poor countries, even though you promised this 7 years ago.
Yeah.
So there is a huge equity thing. We have to keep the pressure up. And
so you said, Anthony, it's just specifically about that, using that as a measure for advocacy, because you talked about how policymakers need really simple infographics and information. And wouldn't that be a concept that would cut through a lot of the sort of justifications for continuing as we are, if we used a global measure for how much each person can pollute?
I think that's true. And I think it is a good measure. I think it then needs to be contextualized locally, because, people see it all as a big thing and there's nothing I can do. Whereas, what would that mean in Glasgow? What would that mean in London, where I am at the moment? What would it mean in, Nepal or Malawi? And I think that is important. I like your idea. I think it's good. Marina, sorry, I'm doing all the talking.
No, I absolutely agree, Danny. It's one of the big arguments where always has to do with the fact that we are looking at our carbon budget, and it is the total emissions that comes towards the carbon budget. So that's where kind of that argument comes. But China, as you well mentioned, is a huge country. It's unfair to weigh equally as a small country like Qatar, for example, where the per capita emissions are humongous. And so that metric has to be made at a per capita basis. And I absolutely agree. And that comes down to what Anthony was saying, that it helps expose the degree to which it is our overconsumption that we do not need in very high income nations that is driving much of this problem, and how we shift towards more sustainable forms of economic reactivation is one of the core elements. So I absolutely agree with you. I think one of the reasons why this is not one of the key messages is purely political, is because it makes China look bad and the US look good in that aspect. If you look at per capita emissions, it is very powerful countries that are at the top of the list. And that is a huge political struggle. It's been also quite interesting during COP, the huge kind of outrage at the last minute watering down of the coal language, where it was India that depends very strongly on coal because their infrastructure depends on coal because they have coal. It's no longer the cheapest alternative, but that's how their economy functions, and they do need it for the continuous development and their well-being. And obviously they should be transitioning, but the reason why India asked for the watering down of the language is because the only fossil fuel that was being mentioned in the biggest climate change treaty that we had this year had to do only with coal. And there was no mention of oil and gas, and oil and gas together make together 55% of greenhouse gas emissions. So the fact that we were mentioning only coal was already underpinned the injustice of the climate negotiations and the fact that we were picking on those countries that still rely on coal because they haven't made that leap in technologies and in cleaner energy use.
Thanks, Prof. I think that was a really interesting point. And I'm going to move on now to Petra. Maya has a question. Petra, I've allowed you to talk if you'd like to ask your question.
Yeah, can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think this sort of gets to where my question is. It's the power struggles, the economic power struggles that unless we really engage with, basically what we're trying to do is ask countries to voluntarily take an economic hit. Unless technologies can develop fast enough that you can continue to grow forever, and no sane country or leader will want to be seen to degrow their economy, because in the international power boys, there's the size of your economy gives you that international clout and influence. And giving that up voluntarily, it's the same argument as with the arms race and nuclear weapons and so on. I don't think we've got a solution for that, but unless we sort of have the discussion in the round of what does it actually mean to move to net zero fast, and what does that do to your economy, and what does that mean to your international influence as a country? If you're serious about it, I don't think we'll get very far. And sort of, yes, it needs to be per capita, but if you look at what it would mean for a person in the UK to live on 3 or 4, those people who've done their personal carbon footprint, it's completely impossible with the way we currently live, the cars, the houses that we have, the international travel. Even if we restrict it severely, it's virtually impossible to get there unless structurally things change in a big way. So it's got to be driven by governments, and governments have no big incentive to weaken their own international clout. So what do you propose?
I would say, yeah, of course, it's very easy to get very depressed. I do think that the world economy is driven by finance. We saw the collapse that happened in 2008 when there was a credit crunch. And one hope is that the finance will recognize that they're going to be as affected, their economy, their banks, their everything, as much as anyone else. And that by taking money away from fossil fuels, you'll start to get a tipping point and a massive shift towards renewables. And hopefully also the pressure of consumers will change the way we eat. And, there are people, poor people in this country do live down at much lower levels because they can't afford cars. They may have the wrong kinds of food, but it's always the wealthy people that have massive carbon footprints. And so we've got to penalize people. The other big thing that is not talked about enough is carbon taxes were a disaster in France when they added on a diesel tax to all the other taxes, and they had the Gilets jaunes come out and, run a year of protests. But I would like to see a government say, right, we're going to slash income tax. We're going to slash it by 70%, but we're going to put instead carbon taxes. So we'll put a huge tax on the producers of oil and fuel, and then you have to choose options that are less carbon consuming. And so the wealthier people will have to pay much more for their flights. a proper price, which includes the environmental damage. There'll be huge incentive to get new technologies into aviation and things like that. So, and you'd have to protect the rural population who need more cars than urban. You know, I've got a car in London, I never use it because you don't need one in London. And you don't actually need it in Glasgow, really. But as you go out further, you do. So you've got to balance all this up with policies that people like, but will respond to. And I don't see enough progressive leadership in that regard.
If I can add on to that, I think, I mean, obviously I agree with you, Petra, that this requires governmental action because you cannot just reduce your footprint by reducing consumption, because there's a point where you need to consume to live. So you do need the energy system to decarbonize. You do need our whole supply chain to be decarbonized if we want to reach full net zero. But one thing that is quite interesting is that I don't think it is the governments that will see the losses. We've done the decarbonization modeling for the NHS across their buildings, their transport, and their supply chain. And the NHS has committed to reach net zero in a very ambitious form by 2045, so before government's commitments. They depend on decarbonization of the energy grid. So they do depend on the government to make that transition towards renewable energies. However, there is a route that could be done there, and there is a way of getting to net zero but by shifting the way that the NHS consumes as well as any other consumes. And one interesting thing is that most of the interventions that you have to do, particularly when it comes to local emissions, to kind of energy consumption, most are incredibly cost efficient. The savings are enormous. The problem is that you need a lot of capital spending. But then again, as Anthony says, that's what drives the wheels of finances, isn't it? This country depends on borrowing and depends on lending today to make investments in the future. And this is a core example of how you can have enormous returns from borrowing today. It just requires political will. And the other interesting aspect is to see kind of what has been happening, for example, with BP. The petrol industry is starting to realize that they have stranded assets. They're making enormous investments for an industry that has no future, because it will not have future. We have to be very, very determined about this. And BP is now starting to kind of greenwash themselves in a very entertaining way, as most of these companies do, but it's also starting to make that transition, starting to realize it's kind of, if you want, from all of the fossil fuel industries that are the biggest evil, is one of the ones that is starting to think, well, we actually need to do something, because otherwise we don't have a business in 50 years. So they really need to incorporate this in their longer term plans. And they're starting to feel that pressure to transition. And finally, there's many countries, most countries, that import fossil fuel. So fossil fuel burning is really expensive. Countries don't have local production of fossil fuel, most of them don't. My country, Argentina, which I feel entitled to speak about quite poorly because it's my country, so I can. We have both fossil fuels, but also huge opportunities for renewable energies, and we're not taking them. We have a lot of, most of the Patagonia has such an amount of wind that we could be self-sustaining in no time. We have a lot of sun in our north, and we have lithium on site as well. The problem is that we're not really investing where we need to invest, because there's other political and economic powers that are still exploring new oil extraction. So that is what the problem is, and those are stranded assets. So there's a lot of politics and economic powers that come to play in undermining that progress.
I think that this is such an interesting debate, and it was interesting your point about the oil companies, because I noticed Shell have recently pulled out of the Cambo oil fields in North Scotland. I thought that was a really interesting development, which I wonder if sort of pressure has made them do that. I think I realise we're reaching 2 o'clock. Lawrence Moore has his hand up, so I think we've got time for just one more question. Lawrence, I've unmuted you if you're...
Hi, yeah, thanks. I was thinking from the UK's position, I put a question in the Q&A about how the focus on production and emissions tends to show the UK in a good light. And so I wanted to hear what you had to say about consumption, but Danny has asked a great question about that and really good suggestion. So the other part of my question was, what can we do about the fact the UK is often the source of so much of the investment and also insurance of highly polluting industries, you know, most of which is overseas. So I think a lot of people in the UK feel we're doing a good job and the problem lies in India and China, etc. But actually we're financing it and underwriting and ensuring most of the worst activity that's going on globally. So any comments on that? And then just because it's the end, I thought no one else has mentioned George Monbiot's essay, which he published just before Glasgow, and he talked about micro-consumerist bollocks. So when he was talking about what can we do as individuals, we need to do what we can, but actually we can't just think we're doing enough if we just try and make these tiny changes in our own consumption decisions. What we have to do is, paraphrasing what he said, is get angry and protest and try and get some of these, you know, these governments and companies to recognize that they need to change their behavior. So just any comments you've got on that on either of those 2 points, please. Thanks.
I agree with everything you've said, actually. Consumption emissions are always left out. So if you know, in other words, if something's produced in China, but we consume it here, who takes the emissions? Well, at the moment it's China. But whereas actually it either should be shared or we should. Yeah, I mean, I agree with all and protesting. I mean, what is it? 65 countries, companies, I think, are responsible for whatever it is, 80, 90% of emissions. So we have got to put pressure on that. But I think the weak point, I mean, they've resisted this for years, like the tobacco companies, like everyone, but the financial aspects may undermine them. I mean, Shell and BP are constantly greenwashing their adverts and stuff. And then Shell put out something the other week saying that they were carbon neutral in their oil ships because they were offsetting the transport cost, but not mentioning the carbon value of the oil within the ship. So, I mean, you know, there's a lot of this stuff going on, but ultimately economics is what, and markets is what makes things happen. George would probably disagree and say, well, look, we've got to reduce consumption and all that, but somehow we have to find a way through that will keep the politicians and consumers and voters on board, but at the same time shift them in a direction which is carbon zero. I mean, maybe I'm being, you know, I'm an impatient pessimist. I am pretty pessimistic about what's going to happen, to be honest. But, you know, Pandora's box, the last thing out was hope. So we have to have a bit of hope for the future and keep pressurizing. And I really welcome, I thought the protests in Glasgow were great. They were the best thing.
Thanks, Anthony. And great question, Lawrence. And I think that's probably a good stage to end today's seminar. We're just past 2 on a moment of hope, which is great. But I just want to finish by saying a huge thank you to Anthony and Marina. I thought that was a really interesting overview, and I think everyone who's here learned a lot. And it's obviously brought a great debate, and we could probably talk here for a lot longer, but so yeah, again, just thank you both, and it'll be great to see the progress on the Lancet Countdown. It sounds like there's a lot more coming out to keep an eye on in the new year as well, with the CAP projects as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for the interesting conversation.